Tonight's story begins on a frozen river in Texas, where a sleeping camp was shattered by gunfire before the sun even touched the plains. What followed was not just a battle between the Texas Rangers and the Comanche. It was a hidden chapter of the frontier wars. A story of betrayal, revenge, stolen children, and a woman whose rescue would become one of the darkest contradictions in American history. But the truth behind these events was buried for generations in letters, reports, and forgotten archives. If you want to uncover what really happened on the Texas frontier, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications, because once this story begins, the past will reveal secrets that history tried very hard to erase. Asterisk. The morning the frost turned red before the sun rose over the Pease River, men were already waiting in the frozen dark for a sleeping camp to wake into horror. What happened that morning was not just an attack on the frontier. It was the opening wound of a history Texas would spend generations trying to hide. December 1860. The Pease River lay under a hard winter silence. Its banks glazed with frost and its grass stiff as wire beneath the boots of men who had learned to move without sound. Somewhere beyond the low, broken hills of northwest Texas, a Comanche camp slept in the last hour before dawn, unaware that death was already watching from the ridgeline above. Captain Lawrence Sullivan Ross had kept his rangers in position through the night, their horses wrapped and their voices reduced to whispers, waiting for the exact moment when the first light would rise behind them and blind the people below. He did not want a fair fight. He wanted surprise, confusion, and the few terrible seconds in which a human being cannot yet understand that the world around them has ended. The scout had counted 15 lodges near a bend in the river, perhaps 60 souls in all, but only a few fighting men remained. Most of the warriors were away, following buffalo to the west across the Caprock. That absence was not unfortunate. It was the opportunity Ross had been waiting for. What remained in the camp were women curing hides, children sleeping beneath robes, and old men too worn by years and winter to ride into battle. These were the hands that kept the nation alive between raids, the quiet labor behind every mounted war party that haunted the Texas frontier. And because of that, the Rangers did not see them as bystanders. They saw them as the weak point in a people they meant to break dot at first light. Ross gave the order. The Rangers came down fast, horses pounding over the frozen ground, revolvers and rifles already firing before the first lodge flap had fully opened. The camp awoke not to warning, but to gun smoke, screaming animals, and bullets tearing through hide walls into the dark shapes inside. A woman stumbled from one teepee, clutching a bundle to her chest, and fell before she had gone 3 steps. Children ran into the grass in every direction. Horses kicked and shrieked against their tethers, while the line of riders surged forward, shooting at movement, at shadows, at whatever rose in panic from the camp below. In those first moments, the old frontier distinction between warrior and mother, between threat and child, vanished completely. For the men charging through the smoke, there was only the target and the trigger. Then, through the chaos, one figure broke from the northern edge of the camp and ran toward the river. She held an infant tight against her body and moved with the desperate, uneven speed of someone who knew she could not outrun a horse, but ran anyway because stopping meant death. A ranger spotted her almost at once and drove after her, closing the distance in seconds. When he came alongside, she turned instead of falling. She raised the child toward him and screamed one word in English, a word so strange in that place that it seemed to stop time itself. "American," she cried. Then again, louder, more ragged, more desperate. "American." Beneath the years of sun and wind, beneath the smoke and prairie dust, her skin was lighter than the others. Her eyes were blue. And in that instant, standing in the frozen grass, while her home burned behind her, the Rangers realized They had not merely struck a Comanche camp. They had found a woman Texas believed had been lost forever. Her name was Cynthia Anne Parker, and the lie that would be built around her rescue had already begun. The Empire of the Plains, long before the Texas Rangers rode into legend. Another power ruled the endless grasslands of North America. It was not a kingdom of stone cities or iron walls, but an empire that moved with the wind, struck like lightning, and vanished before armies could even begin to chase it. To the people of the frontier, the Comanche were not just enemies. They were the storm itself. Long before Texas settlers built their wooden forts and fragile farmsteads along the frontier, the vast plains stretching from Kansas to central Texas belonged to a people who had mastered a way of war unlike anything European soldiers had ever faced. The Comanche did not rule their territory with castles or walls. They ruled it through speed, skill, and a relationship with the horse so complete that outsiders believed the animal and rider had become a single creature. Spanish explorers who first crossed these grasslands described the Comanche with a mixture of awe and fear, because once they appeared on the horizon, they could be gone again before a musket could even be reloaded. Their land, known as Comanche, stretched across more than 200,000 square miles of plains, rivers, and open sky. It was larger than many European nations, and for over a century no empire Spanish, Mexican, French, or American had managed to truly conquer it. The secret of Comanche power was movement. From childhood, Comanche boys and girls learned to ride before they could even walk steadily. Horses were not simply tools for travel. They were the center of life itself. Warriors could ride at full gallop while hanging from the side of the animal, using the horse's body as a shield while firing arrows with terrifying speed. A skilled Comanche rider could release 20 arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload a single rifle shot. Early American soldiers who witnessed this skill compared them to the Mongol horsemen of Asia, warriors who had once conquered half the known world. It was not exaggeration. The Comanche had created one of the most effective mounted fighting cultures in history, and they used it to control the plains through raids that could appear hundreds of miles from their starting point without warning. But the Comanche world was not built on war alone. Their entire civilization rested on the great buffalo herds that roamed the plains like living rivers of muscle and fur. From the buffalo came food, clothing, shelter, tools, and trade goods. Women worked tirelessly to process hides into robes and leather, to dry meat for winter stores, and to build the lodges that formed the heart of each traveling camp. These camps moved with the seasons, following the buffalo and adapting to the rhythm of the land itself. To the Comanche, this was not wandering. It was mastery of a landscape so vast that no fixed settlement could ever control it. Yet as American settlers began pushing westward into Texas during the early 19th century, two completely different worlds began colliding on the same frontier. For the settlers, land meant farms, fences, and permanent towns. For the Comanche, land meant open movement, shared hunting grounds, and freedom across the plains. Each side believed the other threatened its very survival. Comanche war parties raided isolated farms and ranches with terrifying efficiency, killing men who resisted and taking women and children captive to be adopted or traded within their society. For the settlers who survived these raids, the fear became permanent, a shadow that hung over every isolated home and every trail leading into the wilderness. This fear shaped the frontier more than any law or government. Children grew up hearing stories of midnight attacks and distant thunder that was not a storm, but the sound of horses. Entire communities lived with the belief that the plains themselves could turn violent at any moment. And out of that fear, Texas would create something new. Not a regular army, not a police force, something far more dangerous: the Texas Rangers. But the men who formed this new weapon did not yet realize that to defeat the Comanche, they would have to become something very close to the enemy they feared most. The day peace died in San Antonio, in the spring of 1840, both sides believed they were walking into a negotiation that might finally stop the bloodshed. But inside one stone building in San Antonio, trust collapsed into violence so suddenly that history itself seemed to fracture. What began as a peace council ended as a massacre that would poison the frontier for decades. By 1840, the war between Texas settlers and the Comanche had reached a point where neither side could pretend the violence would simply fade away. Settlements across Texas had been raided repeatedly. Families had buried loved ones taken by surprise attacks, and the Comanche themselves faced growing pressure from an expanding frontier that crept deeper into lands they had controlled for generations. Even the fiercest enemies sometimes recognize the moment when endless war becomes too costly, and for a brief moment it seemed both sides might attempt something rare on the frontier peace. Word was sent through traders and intermediaries that Comanche chiefs from the Panatica Band would travel to San Antonio to discuss terms with Texas officials. The settlers demanded one thing above all else: the return of white captives taken during raids over the previous years. The chiefs agreed to bring captives with them as proof that negotiations were possible, and on a clear morning in March, a delegation of Comanche leaders rode into the city. They came not only with warriors, but also with women and children, a sign in their culture that the meeting was meant to be peaceful rather than a trap. The council took place inside a stone building known as the Council House. Texans gathered to watch the arrival with cautious curiosity. While inside the room, officials waited with soldiers hidden nearby in case the talks went badly. The Comanche delegation entered the chamber, carrying themselves with the quiet authority of men who had ruled the plains for generations. Among them were chiefs who had led raids across Texas and whose names were spoken with fear among settlers. The Texans had expected the return of every captive held by the Comanche, a dramatic gesture that would signal true peace. Instead, the chiefs brought only one girl. Her name was Matilda Lockhart, 16 years old, captured 2 years earlier during the raid. When she was brought into the council house, the mood inside the room changed instantly. Those who saw her were horrified. Her body bore signs of severe abuse and torture that shocked even men hardened by frontier life. The Texans believed the Comanche had deliberately held back other captives to ransom them later for goods and money. To them, it was proof that the chiefs had come to bargain rather than surrender. The Texans reacted with anger and suspicion. Officials informed the chiefs that they would be held hostage until the rest of the captives were returned. Soldiers moved into the room, surrounding the Comanche leaders. For the chiefs, the meaning of this moment was instantly clear. They had come under a promise of negotiation, bringing their families as a sign of trust, and now they were being seized like criminals. In Comanche culture, such a betrayal was unthinkable. One of the chiefs reached for a knife, perhaps to fight, perhaps simply refusing to be taken alive. A shot rang out. In seconds, the council chamber erupted into chaos. Soldiers fired into the crowded room, while Comanche warriors fought back with knives and whatever weapons they could reach. Outside the building, more gunfire exploded as soldiers attacked the rest of the delegation waiting in the courtyard. When the violence finally stopped, the floor of the council house was covered in blood. More than 30 Comanche were dead, including chiefs, warriors, women, and children who had accompanied them. Dozens more were captured and imprisoned. News of the massacre spread across the plains faster than any official message could travel. To the Comanche, it was not merely an act of war, it was betrayal under a promise of peace. Within weeks, war parties began forming across Comanche, and what followed would become one of the largest retaliatory raids in the history of Texas. The fragile hope of negotiation had vanished in a single afternoon, replaced by something darker and far more dangerous. The frontier had crossed a line from which neither side would easily return. What the Rangers did at dawn, the reports later called them victories. Quick raids, successful operations. But buried between the lines of those documents was a different story, one that did not fit the heroic legends Texas preferred to tell. Because the Rangers did not always ride into battles. Sometimes they rode into homes. By the 1840s, the Texas Rangers had transformed from scattered frontier patrols into a force built specifically for the brutal realities of the plains. They had learned quickly that chasing Comanche war parties across open country rarely ended in victory. The warriors moved too fast, vanished too easily, and understood the terrain better than any outsider ever could. So the Rangers changed their strategy. Instead of waiting for raids or pursuing warriors who could outride them, they began striking something far more vulnerable, the camps where Comanche families lived between hunts and battles. These camps were not permanent villages, but moving communities, clusters of lodges that could appear beside a river for weeks and then disappear across the plains overnight. Finding one required patience, skilled scouts, and careful observation. When Rangers located a camp, they did not attack immediately. They watched, sometimes for days. They counted the lodges, studied the horse herds, and waited for the moment when the largest number of warriors had left the camp on hunts or raids. That moment, when the fighters were gone, was considered the perfect time to strike. The approach was always the same. Rangers moved through the night, often dismounting and leading their horses through dry riverbeds or along low ravines to avoid being seen against the sky. They positioned themselves on nearby hills where they could watch the camp sleeping below them in the darkness. Many Rangers later wrote about these hours before dawn as the most uncomfortable part of the entire raid. Lying in frozen grass, listening to the quiet sounds drifting up from the lodge's dogs barking, voices murmuring, children crying softly in their sleep. Ordinary life continuing peacefully while armed men waited above, counting the minutes until there was just enough light to aim. When the first pale edge of sunlight touched the horizon, the order came. Horses surged forward. Revolvers and rifles fired before the riders even reached the camp. The goal was shock, confusion, and speed. The first targets were always the horse herds. Rangers rode directly toward the tethered animals, scattering them or shooting them where they stood. Without horses, no one in the camp could escape quickly across the plains, and any warriors returning later would arrive on foot against mounted enemies. Once the horses were gone, the Rangers swept through the camp at full speed. Lodges were fired into before their occupants could fully wake. Smoke rose from overturned cooking fires, while bullets cut through the thin walls of hide tents. In those chaotic first moments, it was often impossible to tell who inside the camp was a warrior and who was not. Figures ran from lodges carrying children or bundles of belongings, only to be caught in the same storm of gunfire. Ranger reports describe these moments in the language of military combat enemy engaged, hostiles eliminated, but the reality inside those camps was far more chaotic and human than the reports suggested. Women screamed in a language the Rangers did not understand while trying to gather frightened children. Elderly men who could barely walk attempted to stand against mounted riders armed with revolvers. Panic spread faster than any organized resistance ever could. After the shooting stopped, the destruction continued with methodical efficiency. Every lodge was burned. Food stores meant to sustain the camp through winter-dried buffalo meat, pemmican, berries were scattered or destroyed. Blankets, robes, tools, and weapons were piled together and set alight until the camp that had stood only minutes earlier became nothing but smoke and blackened earth. The thoroughness was deliberate. Without lodges, horses, or food, a Comanche band could not easily survive the harsh seasons ahead. Some rangers believed this destruction was the only way to break the power of the Plains tribes permanently. Yet standing among the burned remains of those camps, even some of the men who carried out the raids later admitted that what they had destroyed that morning was not merely an enemy position. It had been an entire community. Women, children, and the machinery of erasure. When the gunfire faded and the lodges burned to ash, the real tragedy of the frontier war quietly began. Because what the Rangers took from those camps was not only land, horses, or victory. They took mothers from children, and children from the world they would never see again. When a Ranger raid ended, the battlefield rarely looked like a battlefield at all. The smoke from burning lodges drifted across the plains, the ground scattered with broken tools, spilled food stores, and the silent remains of what had been a living community only minutes earlier. The Rangers gathered what they considered survivors, women and children who had been found hiding in the grass, beneath buffalo roads, or clinging to the bodies of relatives who had fallen during the chaos. Official reports written later used calm administrative language to describe these moments. They spoke of prisoners secured or captives taken, but the quiet phrasing in those reports concealed the raw struggle that often unfolded in the camp after the shooting stopped. Comanche women did not surrender quietly. Many fought with knives, stones, or anything their hands could grasp. Some threw themselves over their children, refusing to move even when threatened at gunpoint. Others screamed and resisted until they were struck or bound. To the Rangers, this resistance confirmed their belief that Comanche women were as fierce and dangerous as the warriors they supported. To the women themselves, it was the instinct of a mother protecting the only life she had left in a world that had suddenly collapsed around her. Once the captives were gathered, the Rangers began the long journey back toward Texas settlements. The column moved quickly, often covering great distances across open country before any Comanche warriors could return and attempt pursuit. The Rangers rode their horses, but the women walked. Their wrists were bound with rawhide straps, sometimes tied to each other or fastened to a saddle to prevent escape. The pace was set by the horses, not by the prisoners struggling to keep up behind them. Days of marching across harsh terrain followed, through heat, dust, and exhaustion that slowly wore down even the strongest captives. Some women had already been injured during the raid. Others carried infants in their arms while trying to keep pace with riders who rarely slowed their advance. When a captive stumbled or fell too far behind, the column did not always stop. The harsh realities of frontier warfare left little patience for those who could not keep moving. The official reports rarely explained what happened to prisoners who collapsed during these marches. They simply recorded how many captives arrived at the destination. But the deepest wound inflicted during these journeys was not physical. It was separation. In the confusion of the raids, children were often taken into custody separately from their mothers. Rangers sometimes grouped children together ahead of the column or placed them with settlers encountered along the return route. Mothers walking behind the column could hear children crying somewhere ahead, but had no way to reach them or even know if they were still alive. For a Comanche mother, this loss carried a pain deeper than any injury. Everything in their society revolved around family and the survival of the next generation. When a child disappeared into the custody of strangers riding east, the loss was final. The child might grow up with a new name, a new language, and a new life among people who would never speak of the world the child had come from. When the Ranger column finally reached a settlement or military fort, the captives were handed over to local authorities or families willing to take them in. To frontier communities that had lived for years under the fear of Comanche raids, these prisoners were often seen as proof that justice had finally been delivered. Crowds sometimes gathered to watch them arrive, staring at the bound women as if they were symbols of the enemy who had haunted their nightmares. Yet behind the silence of those exhausted prisoners was a truth few settlers fully understood. The war between Texas and the Comanche was not only destroying warriors on the battlefield, it was dismantling families, erasing cultures, and scattering children so completely that an entire people risked disappearing piece by piece across the frontier. And among the many stories buried inside that tragedy, one woman's fate would soon reveal just how cruel the idea of rescue could become. The cruelty of Rescue Texas celebrated the moment as a miracle. A lost daughter returned to civilization, but the woman standing in the frozen grass beside the Pease River did not believe she had been saved. For Cynthia Anne Parker, rescue was only another kind of captivity. When Captain Lawrence Sullivan Ross realized the woman he had captured near the Pease River was Cynthia Anne Parker, the news traveled across Texas like a story people had waited decades to hear. Newspapers described it as one of the greatest triumphs in the history of the frontier. 24 years earlier, a young girl had been taken during the attack on Fort Parker, carried away into the vastness of Comanche territory, and believed lost forever. Now, against all odds, she had been recovered. To the people of Texas, it felt like history correcting itself. A child stolen by the wilderness had finally been returned to the world she belonged to. But the woman who stood among the rangers that winter morning did not see it that way. Cynthia Anne Parker had not been a captive for 24 years. She had been Comanche. When she was taken as a 9-year-old girl in 1836, her world had shattered in violence, much like the raid that later destroyed the camp at Pease River. Her father and relatives had been killed during the attack on Fort Parker, and she had been carried away into a land that at first felt terrifying and unfamiliar. Yet time changes everything. Over the years, she learned the Comanche language and customs. She learned to ride across the plains with a skill that rivaled any warrior. She learned how to prepare hides, build lodges, and survive in a world where the rhythm of life followed the movement of buffalo herds and the endless sky of the prairie. Eventually, she married a respected Comanche war chief named Petanocona. Together they built a family, raising 3 children within the traditions of the people who had once taken her. By every account recorded by traders and travelers who met her, Cynthia Anne had fully embraced that life. The girl taken from Texas had slowly disappeared, replaced by a woman who no longer spoke English and no longer thought of herself as anything other than Comanche. That was the woman the Rangers captured on the Pease River. To them, she was a symbol, proof that the frontier war had finally returned a lost daughter to civilization. To her, the Rangers had just destroyed her home, killed members of her community, and torn her away from her husband and sons, who had escaped during the chaos of the raid. She begged to be allowed to return to the plains. She tried to explain in a language few around her understood that her family was out there somewhere, that the life she loved had been left burning behind her in the winter grass. But the story Texas wanted was too powerful to question. Cynthia Anne was taken east and placed with relatives who believed they were saving her from a savage existence. They tried to teach her English again, dressed her in unfamiliar clothing, and encouraged her to accept the land and pension the Texas government granted her as compensation for her years in captivity. None of it healed the loss she felt. She attempted to escape several times, trying to ride west toward the plains where her sons still lived among the Comanche. Each attempt ended with someone bringing her back. Her final years were marked by quiet sorrow. The daughter she had carried during the Pease River raid died young from illness, leaving Cynthia Anne completely alone in a society she never truly rejoined. She refused to fully adopt the life Texas expected of her, and never stopped longing for the people she had lost. The frontier war that Texans celebrated as a victory had given her 2 separate tragedies. First the loss of her childhood home, and then the loss of the world she had built afterward. Cynthia Anne Parker died in 1871, still caught between 2 civilizations that both claimed her, but neither truly understood. Her story remains one of the most haunting legacies of the Texas frontier wars. Because sometimes history celebrates events as rescues that feel very different to the people who lived through them. And sometimes the line between salvation and destruction is so thin that it disappears completely in the telling.